So today I was working on this crow illustration, and I just was coloring in the background. And I've had some people ask me about working with markers and getting a really smooth sort of transition. So I always use Copic markers, Copic. They are not cheap. They're about $8 a marker. And you can get them basically at any art supply store. And there is marker paper that is sold specifically to use with markers, which I don't do. I use them on regular sketchbook paper, which is really not good because the paper soaks up a lot of the ink, and it tends to bleed as well, which means you don't get really crisp lines. But depending on what you're doing, you may not care. That's totally up to you. But I wanted to go over sort of the technique that I use for coloring with these. So I'm going to start with this end, not the brush end, and just show you really quickly. I'll make just a square and show you what I do. So let's say here we have our square that we want to color in, right? And we want the color to be nice and flat. We don't want it to be streaky or show any lines, okay? So what we do, this is how I was taught, and it's the technique that I still use. You go really slowly and start at one end, right? And you don't lift up the marker, but you basically color over, let's say, half of the line that you just colored. So what ends up happening is if there are some lighter points or inconsistencies, when you go over it again, in theory, it's going to cover those up, right? So you just want to go really slowly. And again, this is probably killing my marker, which is not ideal, but right? So you can see that that's like a really smooth, flat color, as opposed to going like this, which is totally streaky and not as dark, right? Obviously, this one looks a lot better. So it's just a matter of taking your time, not lifting up the marker, and going over each line essentially twice. If you screw it up and you're not, your line gets a little diagonal or you go over an extra pass, it's not a big deal, right? See how much better that looks. So then additionally, you can think about things like gradients, right? So once the ink has started to dry a little bit, if you do something like this, you're going to eventually start getting a gradient on here. And basically what I did was just sort of went over those lines again, but I lessened the pressure that I'm putting on the paper, right? And it's important to sort of let the ink dry a little bit. But basically, if you keep doing this over and over again, you're going to end up with a light to dark gradient, right? So let's let that dry just a little bit. And again, when you get to the point where you're sort of want the gradient, you're going to lighten up on the pressure that you put on here. So there you can start to see, right, the difference between this square, which is a gradient that we're going for, and this one, which is just flat color. Right, so that's about it. It's just a matter of taking your time, going slowly, and recoloring over every line that you draw more than once. Right, and you can see too how this, what I'm talking about, how it's bleeding on the paper, like these lines aren't nice and crisp. For me, either I don't care in the illustration, I want it to be a little messy, or I will color like this and then cut it out in a shape and glue it onto another page, so it doesn't matter to me if the lines aren't crisp. But again, that's just you know, what I use, you don't have to do it that way. Right, there we go. So that is how I use the markers. I hope that was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.